I will start out by first introducing our speaker, Professor Harry de Gorter. He's a professor in the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics here in the S.C. Johnson College of Business. His research focuses on applied welfare economics and political economy of agricultural policy and trade. And he's got a very rich stream of research in food waste, particularly. Some of you may have seen last year, the World Bank released a large report called Addressing Food Loss and Waste, a Global Problem with Local Solutions. I'll drop a link to that in the chat later on, but that was a collaboration between the World Bank, Cornell University, and RAP. And Harry was led the Cornell group in producing that report. So he's our resident food waste economics expert, or at least I like to think so. So I'll let Harry, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, let me share my slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the economics of food waste and in the context of a supply chain. So in a nutshell, when you look at food waste, we're looking at food waste in the entire supply chain, right from harvest in our model so far to consumer is 33% of food production at the farm level. So the food waste is total in the value chain, and the denominator is at the farm level only. So what is the supply chain? Well, and the model that I've developed for as Aaron said, for the World Bank, but can be adapted by anybody, is simplifying it for a typical developed country. We look at production, no pre-harvest loss yet. We're working on pre-harvest loss in the model now. The second stage is storage, handling, and transportation. Then we have the processor, the third stage. And the processor goes to either the retailer or to the food service sector. And then from the retailer, it's at home, and the food service is away from home. That's the final consumer. So we have demands at home and away from home food with cross price elasticities. So this is sort of what I call the vertical supply chain, and in the context of analyzing food waste. Then for each link here, for each link in the vertical supply chain, I have what I call the horizontal aspects of food waste. So for each link, like let's take an example from the farmer to the processor. Okay, I'm skipping the handler, sorry about that. But just imagine one link. You start off with production QI at that stage, and then you have alpha times QI of food waste, where alpha is some parameter less than 1. And the rest of the production goes downstream to the next stage in the length. So once food waste prevention policies is focusing on the alpha, the rate of food waste. And this quantity of food waste has basically in our model, 3 places to go. To be recovered, recycled policies. Okay, so everything recovered are feed, fertilizer, pet, energy, and compost. In the middle, we have non-recoverable uses, and that goes to land, sewage, or landfill incineration. And to the left, we have diversion policies diverted for food use. And you have different policies to recover, recycle, different policies on other uses, like a ban on landfill, ban on sewage. And of course, diversion policies. Now notice that if you ban sewage here, then the stuff that otherwise go to sewage would either go to landfill incineration or come back up the system and affect the amount recovered, and up here, the amount wasted. Presumably would have less wasted, more going to recover. Or think of another example. Imagine if we subsidized biomass for energy, then you're releasing more of the food waste more easily to recover, which means you could actually increase food waste up the system here and less going in this thing. So it's a systems approach for the horizontal, not to mention the vertical. The previous slide, it's also has its own unique system approach that has what I call cascading effects, or otherwise indirect economic effects. And these become important when you're analyzing the effects of economic policies on food waste. Okay, so that's This is the vertical. This is what I call the horizontal. I know some of you scientists are working on new technologies here for recovering and recycling and for other uses. And so that will affect the outcome as well. But most of from now on, I'm going to talk about policies that are going to reduce alpha. Okay, from this point to this point is what happens when you focus on reducing alpha. This is going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about. So a typology is, I just said that, focusing on alpha. You could also focus on the diversion, food recovery, and landfill. I won't be discussing that later, but it's in the literature that I will give you at the end of the talk, in terms of if you want to have a follow-up on that. So the question is, what affects these parameters? How do policies change alpha? One policy in one category affect levels of all other 4 activities. And of course, we're going to have what's called in economics pecuniary externalities. In other words, it's going to change the amount of supply, demand. It's going to have market effects, knockoff effects. It's going to increase or decrease prices. And that will not only affect production and consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, but also the level of food waste, because I'm going to show you in a moment, food waste is endogenous to the model. In other words, we have a cost function, and it'll affect on the opportunity costs. That the rate of food waste will change as well. Just a quick overview. Why do we observe food loss and waste from an economics perspective, that is? And it's rational to have food waste. Zero food waste doesn't pay. It wouldn't pay for an individual consumer or farmer, the middleman, whoever. You waste food until the marginal benefits of wasting it is equal to the marginal cost of not wasting it. And of course, these costs are higher, the higher we have more incomes and higher opportunity costs of time. And this is what we will focus on. Another reason why we observe food waste from an economics point of view is option value. The cost of having too little food on hand is greater than having too much. And that is the case for everybody. Let's think of the farmer. The farmer doesn't know what the prices are going to be, doesn't know what the yield, weather's going to be. They got to produce, they got to fill contracts. They may not harvest at all, prices are lower, weather is bad, the yield is low. So they always do more than they need, because that's the nature of their economic decision. Likewise, for a restaurant, they have to have more steaks on hand they're going to sell. They just can't afford to run out. So if you think of every agent economic, and this is what we call the news vendor model in economics, there's asymmetric cost benefit of having too much or too little. And the outcome is you're going to waste food until you can deal with it. All right. And you can't deal with it. So this is sort of the option value. We haven't incorporated our model. Our model is only focusing on the top one here, the standard. There's a cost and there's a benefit, and you make the right trade-off. There's 2 other reasons why: market failures, people don't know. There's imperfect information, there's constraints for the credit at the farm level, problems of economies of coordination and supply chain. There's lots of reasons why we observe food waste that government policies can directly impact. And finally, of course, as non-optimizing agents, they're subject to psychological, sociological, and cultural biases. This is also a very important aspect of why we observe food waste. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the economic model. And so now I'm going to get into some serious modeling issues that everybody should consider. Is that we differentiate for the consumers the difference in what they purchase and what they consume. And we also differentiate for each intermediary, processor, handlers, retailers, the purchases versus the sales for each intermediary. So that means the difference between purchase and sales is waste. And finally, at the farm level, we differentiate between gross production versus sales for farmers. So we build in the economic model, the actual waste at each level of the vertical supply chain. Remember, we have the horizontal for each link in the vertical going on as well. So before we go to analyze, I'm going to, in a minute, give you the most fundamental notion of the economics of food waste. But we got to ask ourselves, well, why are we concerned about food waste? Well, and what is the impact? How do you analyze the economics of food waste? Well, first, you got to, what are the underlying policy objectives? And the second thing is going to really depend on the structure of the market. I'm just going to summarize that at the end here today. And of course, it depends on what interventions you have or market shocks that can induce reductions or increases in food loss and waste. We have some pretty big market shocks. We're having one right now. We had one with COVID. We had one with biofuels. We had one for various reasons. Okay, so in terms of the objectives, so if an economist needs an objective before we can even analyze the outcome of a policy that reduces a rate of food waste, and the three most common ones are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing farm production because there's a lot of stress on natural resources like land and water, and reducing the value of waste because that reflects the social cost of resources wasted. And they're not always in the same, they don't always go in the same direction. In other words, you might reduce the value of waste, but not farm production and greenhouse gas emissions. And the other three are improving farm welfare. That's important in developing country, improving food security. Inflation, food inflation is an issue again, not just in developing countries, but also in countries like the United States, food insecurity is an issue. And for developing countries, increasing the value of trade is an important aspect as well. So let's notice that the level of food waste is not included as a policy objective. It's a policy parameter of reducing the rate of food waste, but it's never an objective to reduce the quantity of food waste from an economist's point of view. Okay, so now everybody has to take a deep breath and listen up. And if you don't get, if you come out of here on my presentation, this slide, the next is sort of the crux of the matter. There are a few other important issues too, but this is the crux of the matter. Let's look at the basic economics of reducing food waste. And let's consider a tomato farmer who delivers his own tomatoes directly to a wet market. And the consumers are there to purchase it at a wet market. And let's analyze post-harvest loss only. So that we're only going to look at post-harvest loss from the farmer to the wet market. Okay. And the farmer puts his tomatoes, fresh tomatoes, into a burlap bag. And then assume marketing costs are zero. In other words, taking it from the farm to the wet market where the consumers are, the costs are zero. The children deliver it, like an immigrant Dutch farm boy like myself who worked hard on the farm. Now as I go through the points, you're thinking, oh, this is just an abstract economist talking. And I'm just an abstract economist, like typical, right? This is what I'm giving you here is exactly a case study. In this is exactly everything I'm going to say here is exactly what happened in Africa. Okay, an example in Africa. Then we had 30% were waste because of spoilage due to bruising, etc., in the burlap bags. This is exactly what happened. This was an empirical study done. And then the cost. Here's the point. Because you lose 30% of the spoilage due to bruising, the cost of that waste must be recovered with higher prices for the consumers. In other words, whatever the farmer gets at the farm level, all right, because a portion of it is wasted, that farmer needs a higher price to overcome the costs incurred from that waste. And this is my economic model takes all of this into consideration. So the effective price of farmers is lower for total production, but the value of waste at prices must be offset by higher farm prices to consumers for the tomato sales after the loss. Otherwise, you just don't have an economic equilibrium. There's no market that would sustain anything else. And so then the final thing is, suppose an NGO comes along. By the way, there's no supposing about it. An NGO did come along and distribute plastic crates to the farmers, and the waste goes to zero. What are the economic effects of this actual scenario? What are the market effects? And so here, we're going to analyze the economics. We're going to eliminate food waste in the supply chain with a technological chain. There's no marketing margin because the children are delivering it. We're only looking at one post-harvest loss. There's consumers at the market. We're not worried about consumer waste. We don't know what happens. We have a supply at the farm level, SF. We have a demand at the consumer level of DC. And here is the no food waste equilibrium. The quantity at the farm level, no waste. This is so simple, you're wondering why you're wasting your time listening to me. Here is the supply curve at the farm level times 1 minus alpha M being the marketing waste because it was in a burlap bag. And how do you get an equilibrium when you get so much waste in a market like tomatoes? And economics, what is the equilibrium? Well, it's not that difficult. You choose a point along SF here such that area A, the extra value you get from consumers for sales after the waste, is equal to the total revenue of the waste production that is produced but not sold to consumers, area B plus C. So area A is the price premium for those what is consumed, and that's the sales by the farmer, is equal to area B plus C, the difference between total production QF and total farm sales Q sales. That is the unique equilibrium. Now, what happens if you eliminate food waste? Then the dotted lines just disappear. Where do you end up? You end up at the no food waste equilibrium right here. What happens to production? Production goes up. How can that be? Okay. How can production go up? Well, it'll go up if you reduce food waste. If demand is elastic, if demand is price inelastic, it will go down. And this is a fundamental result in economics. And you do this at every link in the supply chain for every agent in the economy. So that leaves us, this is the consumer one. You don't want to know it. You don't want to see the consumer, what happens. You don't want to see those diagrams. I gave you the simplest of simplest worlds. The key point is reducing food waste does not necessarily reduce farm production or consumer purchases. It depends on demand elasticity. And the next question is, how will it affect all other variables like farm sales, etc.? And that is we have the direct effect of reducing alpha, the rate of food waste, which I just described to you in economics. But then you have the cascading or indirect effects in the vertical supply chain. And that gets you into very interesting outcomes. All right. I'll skip. This is the structure of the outcomes will depend on all these structures of the market. You know, the most important one would be the level and distribution of rates of waste along the supply chain that determine the share of food waste everywhere. But I'll let you read that on your own, and I'll skip this slide. But I'll just give you one last slide to give you an idea now. What are the direct versus indirect effects of reducing food waste? So we already showed that if you reduced food waste at the farmer level, okay, the change in farm production could be plus or minus. All right, so the first one is change in farm level, but farm sales always goes up if you reduce waste at the farm level. So it's always positive. The processor can be plus or minus all the way to processor sales, then it's always positive. At the final consumer, okay, consumption always goes up. Notice that consumption always goes up when you reduce food waste, which is a very interesting result, by the way, and a good and it's correct result. But consumer purchases, the second last slide here, I want you to focus on here, is that for an inelastic demand, purchases go down. For an elastic demand, purchases go up. And then it's all negative that way and all positive all the way up to the farm. See, change in farm production is negative. If you reduce consumer food waste, alpha C, farm production go up or go down or go up. It all depends. And so, so I'll just conclude with this slide. All right. Greenhouse gas emissions do not decline necessarily. It depends on the distribution of waste rates versus carbon emissions along the value chain. Depends on the direct versus indirect cascading effects. It depends very importantly on closed versus open economy. If you're an open economy, and the trade share, surprisingly, is an important variable. And finally, it really depends on the farm share of the consumer dollar. If the farm share of the consumer dollar is very high, you can get very different impacts of reducing food waste on greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, and that carries forward to the other policy objectives I identified in that earlier slide. The only thing that we can say for sure, the value of food waste declines, the greater the reduction of food waste is downstream, the more towards the consumer. But I've eaten up my time, but I just wanted to get some basic concepts into, you can see these slides for yourself. Here is the work that I've done on food waste, a couple of papers for the FAO that get the intuition, the ball rolling, then studies prepared for the World Bank, very detailed, very intensive, then World Bank publications, one very general, and then individual country analysis, and then 2 journal articles. And here's the website to get access to that. So I'm going to unshare and stop there. And hopefully I could get some intuition to you as to the enormity of the issue that we're talking about.
Thanks, Harry. I think you've got everyone's head spinning in a good way. I think the clear ramifications here, at least the takeaway that I say, it's not as simple as it looks. Reducing food waste does not necessarily, if your policy objective is to improve environmental outcomes, reducing food waste is not it's not clear what's going to, what it's going to do, depending on where that happens along the supply chain. Is that an accurate sort of distillation of what your model shows?
Yes, that's one. That's correct.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask, if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. But I did have one question I wanted to ask. So I mean, if you're, when you see all of these initiatives, let's say industry initiatives to try to reduce food waste, I mean, what jumps out at you as sort of a, it seems like, based on the model you presented, it seems like the approaches or the way that we think about food waste in the industry tends to be fairly simplistic. And what you're telling us is that there's a lot more to it in terms of what the intended outcome is. I mean, is there any advice you might offer as far as, if we're a food focused firm trying to essentially do our part to reduce food waste, what should we be thinking about? Let's say I'm a food manufacturer. What from an economics perspective, what should I be thinking about as a manager to make sure that what I'm doing actually is going to have a positive effect in trying to reduce food waste and not have some unintended consequence? I know that's a big, broad question, but
yeah, and I'm not sure my model can actually answer that. I mean, if you're really interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and typically in a food supply chain, most of the greenhouse gas emissions at the farm level. So you want to focus at the farm level to reduce, that's more important in terms of the objective of greenhouse gas emissions on a typical product, and maybe not necessarily fruit. And if you're really worried about reducing the economic cost, like the value of food waste, the further you go down the supply chain, the higher the marketing margins and the costs are. You want to focus on the consumer level. So you can come up with conclusions like that. But I don't know how relevant it is, or if you're an intermediary, you can't do anything about the consumer and you can't do it with the producer, then depends on your situation, what effect you could have. But I mean, reducing food waste is not always bad. It's just that you could lower prices, okay, and you're going to increase consumption and then maybe production. It's not like you're doing a bad thing to society, but you're not necessarily getting the net overall result that you think you're going to get. That's all.
Got it. Any other questions from the audience? I see there's a question from Julie from Professor Goddard. She asks, does the model shift if things like animal feed and pet food are considered as direct food streams? Yes.
So anything that changes the economics and what I call the horizontal has it filters up into the vertical supply chain. And so any change anywhere will filter into the total supply chain. Is it large in terms? We did 4 commodities for the UK: dairy, a fruit, a vegetable, and I can't remember a livestock. I can't remember what the commodities were. So it all interacts. So if you get a technology that increases recycling, I mean, I can't remember, but it could easily have more food waste. Okay, because you're putting less pressure on the horizontal, and so in the vertical you get, okay, it's cheaper for me then to produce, and so you'll get the model is all linked interactively. So the answer is yes.
And we have one question from Al, actually, and this will be, I think our audience will appreciate this as well. Can you talk through sort of give us the intuition around how elasticity of demand affects food waste? Can you sort of give an intuitive illustration of how that works for those who aren't as economically well versed here?
Okay, so that's a good question. And I don't have it on the top of my head, but let me give it a try. So what happens is it's all about purchases. Okay, so it's consumption. When you reduce food waste, you're always going to increase your consumption. That's not an issue, but it all has to do with purchases. So if you remember the total revenue under a demand elasticity, okay, so if it's elastic, you're going to increase your consumption, and that will have that what looks like an adverse effect through the revenue effect on the demand side. So it's related to total revenue under a demand curve, the concave function.
Got it. Okay, and I think we've got one more question. We've got time for one more question. Martin has a question. Said, is it possible that production of some plant-based foods sequesters carbon, and that reducing waste there actually has a negative effect on sustainability?
I don't quite understand the question. It is true that if you read my original FAO reports, that how we define here, I am defining it in my model, and we as a group we are defining food waste given the structure of production and consumption in the food system. Why should we assume that eating meat is not food waste? Using crops for biofuels is not food waste. I would say that's food waste, but I don't understand I don't understand the question. Sequestering it in plant food, meaning you don't give it to animals and you feed it directly?
But it's just you have the waste, and the food gets, let's say, composted, that slowly releases carbon. So you have a net sequestration effect on some of them, where growing less means less carbon gets sequestered because the land is used for other uses that might not have a sequestration effect.
Oh, exactly. If you can minimize your production, you're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for that very reason. It depends how you have to make sure you have a systems analysis to measure the greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, lower production, lower land use will lower greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that's a good question. I don't derive the coefficients of greenhouse gas emissions related to production, but I'm assuming that they're not using the land for a parking lot, but as you say, for non-agricultural uses in a productive way. So it just depends how you measure the greenhouse gas emissions associated with each unit of ag production. I can't even answer that right now, actually.
All right. Well, I think one last call for questions. We're at 12:35, so we'll probably move along. But I think we have a couple of questions actually that popped up really quick. We'll take one more, and then we'll leave the rest for afterwards. But a quick question from Nate Henderson in the audience. He says, "How do you think the recent rise in fuel prices will affect food waste?" Any quick takes?
No, other than that's a good question, because it's going to increase marketing margins, which reduces the farm share, which has implications. I can't off the top of my head answer that. But on the other hand, it'll increase food prices. And if you increase food price, in our model, we have the abatement cost function reagent as a function of price. It will more incentive for everybody to reduce waste, including consumers. So we can say that much. Got it.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we are right at time. So we will save the rest of the questions for we can hopefully discuss those during the roundtable. But thank you, Harry, for this incredibly insightful background knowledge on the economics of food waste. Appreciate it.